The USSR anti-religious campaign of 1928 to 1941 was a new phase of anti-religious persecution in the Soviet Union following the anti-religious campaign of 1921 to 1928. The campaign began in 1929, with the drafting of new legislation that severely prohibited religious activities and called for a heightened attack on religion in order to further disseminate atheism. This had been preceded in 1928 of the 15th Party Congress, where Joseph Stalin criticized the party for failure to produce more active and persuasive anti-religious propaganda. This new phase coincided with the beginning of the forced mass collectivization of agriculture and the nationalization of the few remaining private enterprises. Many of those who had been arrested in the 1920s would continue to remain in prison throughout the 1930s and beyond. The main target of the anti-religious campaign in the 1920s and 1930s was the Russian Orthodox Church, which had the largest number of faithful. Nearly all of its clergy, and many of its believers, were shot or sent to labor camps. Theological schools were closed, and church publications were prohibited. More than 85,000 Orthodox priests were shot in 1937 alone. Only 1/12 of the Russian Orthodox Church's priests were left functioning in the parishes by 1941. In the period between 1927 and 1940, the number of Orthodox churches in the Russian Republic fell from 29,584 to less than 500. The campaign slowed down in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and came to an abrupt end after the commencement of Operation Barbarossa. The challenge produced by the German invasion would ultimately prevent the public withering away of religion in Soviet society. This campaign, like the campaigns of other periods that formed the basis of the USSR's efforts to eliminate religion and replace it with atheism supported with a materialist worldview, was accompanied with official claims that there was no religious persecution in the USSR, and that believers who were being targeted were for other reasons. Believers were in fact being widely targeted and persecuted for their belief or promotion of religion, as part of the state's campaign to disseminate atheism. But officially the state claimed that no such persecution existed and that the people being targeted, when they admitted that people were being targeted, were only being attacked for resistance to the state or breaking the law. This guise served Soviet propaganda abroad, where it tried to promote a better image of itself, especially in light of the great criticism against it from foreign religious influences. Education. In 1928, Anatoly Lunacharsky, under the pressure of leftist Marxists, agreed to an entirely anti-religious education from the first grade up. However, he still warned against a general expulsion of teachers with religious beliefs due to the shortage of atheist teachers. In 1929, an agitprop conference resolved to intensify anti-religious work throughout the education system. This led to the setting up of anti-religious sections at all research and higher education teaching institutions. A special anti-religious faculty was instituted at the Institute of Red Professors in 1929. A campaign was led against school teachers of the old intelligentsia who were asserted to be working against the system and were even allowing priests to spiritually influence school children. Teachers accused of such could be fired, and in most cases were imprisoned or exiled. Believers in the ranks of top Soviet scholars were identified by name in the anti-religious press. This labeling led to the 1929-1930 Purge of the Russian Academy of Sciences, where up to 100 scholars, their assistants and graduate students were arrested on forged charges and given sentences that range from 3 years of internal exile to the death penalty. Most of them subsequently perished in camps or in prison. One of the aims of this purge was to take away the church's intellectuals and to assist the propaganda that only backward people believed in God. In one instance, the famous Soviet historian Sergei Platonov was asked why he appointed a Jew named Kaplan to the directorship of the Pushkin House. and he replied saying that he was not a Jew but an Orthodox Christian, and on this basis Kaplan was sent to a concentration camp for 5 years. The Central Committee called off administrative measures against religion from 1930-31, which caused the anti-religious educational work to be weakened. But another resolution in September 1931 reinstituted active anti-religious education. Sergi and the Church. Most of the bishops arrested between 1928 to 1932 were arrested for reasons surrounding opposition to Metropolitan Sergi and his notorious declaration of loyalty. The state did officially maintain the line that church and state were separate in the Soviet Union during this time, despite the many arrests of people for not following their religious leaders. The GPU often cynically questioned arrested believers, "What is your attitude to our Metropolitan Sergi heading the Soviet Church?" Opposition to Sergi was used as a pretext to close many churches and sending clergy to exile. The last officially functioning anti-Sergiite church in Moscow was closed in 1933 and in Leningrad in 1936. After these churches were closed, they were usually demolished or turned to secular use. This campaign greatly diminished the number of functioning churches in the country. Although officially anti-Sergiite churches were destroyed, many unofficial underground church communities existed and formed what was called the Catacomb Church. This underground church movement claimed to be the true legitimate continuation of Orthodoxy in Russia. 20% of inmates at the Solovki camps in 1928-1929 were imprisoned in connection with these affairs. Between 1928 and 1931, at least 36 bishops were imprisoned and exiled, and the total number surpassed 150 by the end of 1930. This did not mean, however, that clergy loyal to Sergi were safer, for they were also widely attacked and arrested. Metropolitan Sergi told foreign press in 1930 that there was no religious persecution and that Christianity shared many social goals with Marxism. A large number of clergy had made peace with Sergi by 1930. Due to the massive number of bishops being arrested, both the Orthodox and the Renovationists consecrated bishops secretly who could take the place of arrested bishops and continue the apostolic lineage. Also, as a result of this massive arrest of bishops, the Orthodox Holy Synod ceased functioning in 1935. According to the anti-religious press, priests would wander from village to village surreptitiously performing religious services in the homes of believers, while being disguised as wandering repairmen, or some other profession. It also claimed the young people were being attracted to Christianity by clergy who hired themselves out free of charge to youth parties as games organizers, musicians, choir directors, readers of secular Russian literature, drama circle directors, etc. It also claimed that many believers were keeping themselves away from churches and priests due to shame of observing religious ritual overtly, and that in response to this many priests performed religious rituals in absentia. This meant that marriage ceremonies were performed over rings that were then sent to absent bride and groom, or that funeral services were performed over empty coffins in which the corpse was later laid in a secular funeral. Legislative measures. The LMG called for sectarians to be expelled from farm management in 1929. In 1929, Lunacharsky made some statements in which he claimed that religious freedom could be suspended when it is abused for the direct class struggle against the proletarian dictatorship, while Lunacharsky had urged moderation. This quotation would be taken out of context in order to justify the intense anti-religious persecution carried out in the next decade. The Church's successful competition with the ongoing and widespread atheistic propaganda prompted new laws to be adopted in 1929 on religious associations, as well as amendments to the Constitution, which forbade all forms of public, social, communal, educational, publishing or missionary activities for religious believers. The Church thereby lost any public voice and was limited strictly to religious services that took place in the walls of churches. Atheist propaganda continued to have an unlimited right of propagation, which meant that the Church could not respond to the arguments used against it any longer. The Church was not permitted to run study groups for religious adults, organize picnics or cultural circles, or organize special services for groups of believers, such as school children, youth, women or mothers. Any pursuit of the true pastoral duties by clergymen became punishable by law. These laws also forbade Christian charity efforts, participation of children in religious activities, and religious functionaries were restricted to the area associated with them. Young pioneer organizations were urged to participate in the anti-religious struggle by the 16th Party Congress. The same Congress also made it illegal for children to serve as acolytes in churches or to be drawn into groups for home religious instruction. The official explanation for this campaign was that the state was vulnerable due to foreign religious efforts and that therefore the churches in Russia needed to be deprived of all public rights with the exception of liturgical services conducted within church walls. All of these regulations together made it much easier for the state to arbitrarily persecute clergy and their families, especially with regard to the discriminatory financial, land use and housing regulations. In 1929 the Soviet calendar was changed to replace the 7-day work week with a 6-day one, with 5 days of work and the 6th day off. This was done in order to force people to work on Sunday instead of going to church. The Soviet leadership instituted measures to stop the celebration of Christmas and other religious feasts. For example, the 25th and the 26th of December were proclaimed days of industrialization, in which the whole country was obligated to celebrate national industrialization by being at work for the whole day. High work absenteeism on religious feast days was reported throughout the 1930s. However, workers that did go to church services on working Sundays or on such religious feast days could be punished for truancy. The new work week remained in effect until 1940. The celebration of the traditional Russian holiday of New Year was prohibited. Gatherings and religious processions were initially prohibited and later on strictly limited and regulated. In later years, a more subtle method of disrupting Christian holidays involved broadcasting very popular movies one after the other on the major holidays when believers are expected to participate in religious processions, especially during the Easter celebration. Apparently, this was intended to keep those whose faith was uncertain or wavering in their homes and glued to their TVs. In 1929 a resolution of the CPSU Central Committee called on the Komsomol to eliminate religious prejudices from its membership through mandatory, voluntary political education. Coercive pressure was applied to members of trade unions and local party cells to join the League of the Militant Godless. In 1930, the 16th Party Congress mentioned the duty of the party to help the emancipation of the masses from the reactionary influence of religion, and called on trade unions to correctly organize and strengthen anti-religious propaganda. The party adopted a resolution at its 16th Congress that priests should not be invited to private homes, donations to churches should discontinue, and that trade unions should be pressured not to perform any work for churches. It also called upon the unions to boost anti-religious propaganda. Financial persecution. The church was treated as a private enterprise and clergy qualified as kulaks for taxation purposes, and they were subject to the same oppressive taxation that was introduced for private peasants and shopkeepers. The lack of regulations that defined how such should be assessed allowed for arbitrary assessments and financial persecution. The rural clergy were required to pay the full tax on land use, along with tax on income received for special clerical functions as well as a special tax paid by those deprived of voting rights. All church communities were required to pay a special tax on the leased church building at 0.5% of the market value of the building, which would be arbitrarily assessed by the state insurance office. Furthermore, clergy and conscientious objectors had to pay a special tax for not serving in the armed forces, but still had to serve in special auxiliary forces when called upon. This tax was equal to 50% of the income tax on incomes under 3,000 rubles and 75% of the income tax on incomes greater than 3,000 rubles. Through all of these taxes combined, the taxes charged to clergy could exceed 100% of their income. Failure to pay taxes could be criminally prosecuted and lead to imprisonment or exile in Siberia. Failure to pay taxes could also be treated as a subversive activity to undermine the Soviet economy during the 5-year plan and could lead to execution. Clergy were deprived of any social security rights as well. Up until 1929, the Church could insure their clergy for medical care and for pension by paying required sums. But after this date all such sums were to be kept by the state and no insurance or pension would be issued, including to clergy who were already retired. This caused clergy to be only served by doctors who could charge as much as they wanted. Since the Church had been deprived of property in 1918, and the clergy had no fields to till as a result, along with the fact that the wealthier members of their congregation were being liquidated and the clergy were still forbidden to collect membership dues, they often no longer had a financial base to maintain their churches. Discriminatory land use policies had been introduced prior to 1929, which made it such that clergy who wanted land plots for private cultivation needed special permission, and that this permission could only be given if no one else requested the land for use. And if such a request did arise, the state could confiscate the land from the clergyman and give it to the person who requested it. The clergy also had no priority and claim to the land that belonged to the Church prior to 1917. In 1928 it was made illegal for clergy to join cooperative and collective farms. In addition, there were no laws that limited the rights of local governments to refuse land plots to clergy arbitrarily. All of this legislation contributed to a situation in which the clergy had no land to cultivate. Clerical housing began to be rented at 10% of their commercial value in 1929. Clergy that had annual income surpassing 3,000 rubles could not remain in nationalized or municipalized buildings, and they had to be evicted by April 8, 1929. No further leases of such buildings to clergy of any income were permitted, and it was also made illegal for them to reside in the homes of others. The only way they could live then was in private houses that they rented, of which after the collectivization nothing remained except semi-rural cottages. In the context of the persecution, few lay people would offer such housing to clergy out of fear of reprisal. This lack of housing forced many priests to leave their vocation and take civilian jobs. Priests' wives could nominally divorce their husbands in order to get jobs to support their families. Priests could be seen in rags in front of churches begging for alms, and reportedly it could occur where priests had to mount the pulpit wearing their underclothes for lack of any other clothing that they owned.